Hello everybody and welcome to today's lecture on Turkish people, namely their origins in their homeland of Turkey and their true homeland of Turan. Or Turan right over here actually. Both of them are valid. But we're going to be discussing a period of Turkish history that spans thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. And will start us from the steppe of Asia and end all the way in the streets of Istanbul. As many people would know it, Turks are not native to Turkey, actually. They are not native to what we know as the Anatolian Peninsula. The modern state of Turkey basically starts at World War I. So as you can see, in World War I, we have Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. Briefly, the Italians, but we're not getting into it. So they basically are fighting against the Allied powers in World War I. They get their asses completely creamed. The Ottomans have a few good moments, like Gallipoli, but regardless, the Ottomans are completely destroyed by not only Allied fighting, but also revolts in their Middle Eastern Arab populations. So they lose a lot of their Middle Eastern land. And due to their overall loss in World War II, they are basically partitioned and occupied by multiple different Allied powers. As seen here in the Treaty of Sèvres, where you have this, basically this main Anatolian Turkish state, and then you have an Armenian state, you have an Italian-owned territory, you have this pinkish territory right here called the Zone of the Straits here. This is like supposed to be what is essentially a type of Greek type of control, and also an international zone owned here. So this is like complete partitioning of Turkey, not to mention even the Greek territories that are being made on Anatolia as well. So you can see here that Anatolia is completely split up into so many different states, not even accounting for the English and the French here, but that is halted by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Now, he was actually a field marshal in the Ottoman Empire days, but basically him, alongside multiple different disenfranchised Ottoman military personnel, will basically revolt against the Treaty of Sèvres. Where is my picture of the War of Independence? But essentially, from this, Ataturk will completely smash every single opponent in his way during the Turkish War of Independence. And following that, following him smashing all of his opponents, he was able to take control of Anatolia and reestablish a Turkish state over Anatolia, that being, of course, Turkey. And that brings us to the modern day nation of Turkey. And when we want to go over the origin of Turkey, we should start at the earlier history of Anatolia. So let's start about 10,000 BCE, shall we? Now, in terms of the landmass of what we know as Anatolia right here, basically was home to a myriad of different human civilizations for much of its history, actually. The earliest, the most famous example is 9500 BCE, where we have the Göbekli Tepe or whatever. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's essentially an early site of human habitation and a very large settlement. I believe thousands of people lived in this settlement, and so because of that, you can see this as like an early form of human habitation when in Anatolia. There's also the Urfa man, which is essentially the earliest form of human life like structure, right? Like the earliest form of a human-like statue being constructed. I believe, from what I read on Wikipedia, that was at 12,000 BCE, so we'll have to see about that. And there are a myriad of different civilizations and peoples that lived in Anatolia after the fall of this ancient site here. However, I only have so many fucking pictures to add on this fucking board until it becomes a little ridiculous, and ink costs a lot of money. Thank you, Mr. Printer. So we're gonna go ahead and skip thousands of years to the Hittites, one of the strongest Bronze Age powers in this time period. They're a major player, and they will unfortunately collapse during the Bronze Age collapse. That hundreds of years later, we will have the Lydians. that basically occupy Western Anatolia. They split it with Sicilia and Media. The Medes basically own a gigantic empire that stretches from the eastern tip of Iran-Shah and all the way to Anatolia here. But we're not going to include them because 550 BCE, we have the Persian Empire that basically conquers the Median Empire, then the Babylonian, and then, of course, the Lydian Empire, or the Lydians. As always, though, of course, the son, Cambyses, would be the one to conquer Egypt. So that is something to keep in mind about here. And then afterwards, Alexander the Great would do his Alexandering and basically destroy the Persian Empire, conquer it. He would die afterwards, and because of that, his empire is split apart between his many different Greek generals. Here we have a period known as the Wars of the Diadochi, basically. Afterwards, we have the Roman Empire here in 117 BCE. Now, I have the Roman Empire set at 117 CE, the Common Era. However, actually, I should put it down for 100 and what is the number? 190 BCE. So 190 BCE. That is a terrible color of blue, but essentially this is the time period where Anatolia is conquered by the Romans at the Battle of, hold on a second, Magnesia, between the Pergamons and the Roman Republic. So that basically covers the transition here until, of course, 555 AD or CE. This is, of course, the Byzantine Empire at its height, essentially conquering most of the Mediterranean in some fashion. And we see that over here, this is where the major nucleus of the Byzantine Empire resides in. So you see the transition of Anatolia existing between its many different native peoples here. You know, I wrote down some of them, but I kind of got a little lazy. So that is a bit essentially the timeline, so to speak. The timeline that we're talking about earlier, from the Turkish Wars of Independence to the founding of Turkey, only existed from 1919 to 1923 CE. So you can see that this brief period, which was only about 4 years, if you count the end of the Ottoman Empire at the World War I, 5 years with 1918, then this period of time is incredibly small and only pertains to the modern nation of Turkey here. And then afterwards, we have all of these non-Turkic peoples that basically lived, died, and breathed on Anatolia. Now, 555 CE is the maximum extent of the Byzantine Empire at this time. The Byzantine Empire will go through many different periods of rise and fall, and eventually, later down the line in our history of this lecture, we will talk about a good period of the Byzantine Empire, 1025 AD or CE. This is the period of time where the Byzantines are entering a resurgence, so to speak. However, unfortunately, that is not what we're going to be talking about right now. Right now, what we're going to be talking about is, since we're done with all of these different Anatolian peoples that have lived here, let's talk about the subject of the video, the Turks. Where are they? Well, they're nowhere near us right now, that's for sure. Now, the Byzantine Empire came from, of course, the Roman Empire right here. The Roman Empire, of course, started out as a city-state in Rome on the peninsula of Italy, and then quickly from that giant boot expanded across Europe. Now, essentially, things would go chillingly for the Romans. In fact, I've already stated in the previous slide that at 190 CE, they essentially conquered Anatolia and owned it for a good chunk of time, climaxing in their maximum extent at 117 CE or 117 AD. Now, things would go very well until, of course, the crisis of the 3rd century, in which, of course, shit hit the fan. The primary cause that is believed to have been started from the crisis of 3rd century is essentially different people being able to consolidate power in the Roman Empire under the noses of the emperors. And so the Emperor Diocletian essentially argued that the Roman Empire was far too big for any one person to manage and contend with and all that stuff. And in order to not create a situation like the crisis of the 3rd century, where you just have the Roman Empire split apart between many different peoples, instead now we have the Tetrarchy. The Tetrarchy is essentially a system in place created by Emperor Diocletian, where the Roman Empire would be split up between 2 emperors and their subordinates underneath them. That would basically control the Roman Empire and split it up. Now, when Emperor Diocletian died, of course, unfortunately, the idea of splitting up the empire still persisted and will persist until the reign of Diocletian I, I believe. He was basically the last Roman emperor to own the western and eastern half of the Roman Empire. And after he died, well, boom, Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine, or I should say the western and eastern half of the Roman Empire, this half and this half, basically split apart after Diocletian I's death. And because of this, the eastern half and the western half developed differently. Now, because of the eastern half was more richer, more urbanized, had better trade, just overall diffed the fuck out of the Western Roman Empire, they just developed better. And so, over time, the Western Roman Empire declined, the Eastern Roman Empire thrived. The Western Roman Empire will eventually be completely overrun with barbarians, leading to its fall, and the Eastern Roman Empire will survive, becoming the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire will survive for many centuries, many millennia, and will apex in size at about 555 AD or CE. And we'll deal with a minutia of different enemies. We've got Bulgars, we've got Persians, we've got Arabs, and then we have Byzantines. The amount of Byzantine civil wars, dynastic disputes, revolts between different generals is massive. And this is basically a huge chunk of some of the problems the Byzantines have to deal with. Now, unfortunately, the Byzantines will have to contend with the Islamic conquest of the Middle East. And so because of that, they will lose much of their Middle Eastern territory in the future, essentially, confining them to Anatolia and Greece and Balkans and all that stuff area. And they'll be declining for a while until the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, where the Macedonia dynasty of the Byzantine Empire will take hold and create a new golden age for the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire will start to expand in all directions because of this. So we're at this part of the Byzantine Empire. Now, there is a strategy that the Byzantine Empire is employing in order to maintain its domination over its newly conquered territories in the eastern half of its empire. And that would be, of course, in using a vassal system as a buffer wall between the Byzantine directly owned territories and outside forces. Now, this vassal wall was extremely vital, as this territory, because of the Islamic conquest of the Middle East, basically was under the command of foreign forces for a long period of time. So when the Byzantine Empire comes in and reclaims these territories, they need to start reconsolidating them. So because of that, the vassal screen is extremely important to protect Byzantine assets that they've newly acquired, that they're newly putting back into their directly owned territories. Now, this vassal wall will start from Syria going eastward all the way to Armenia, and then there will also be a series of Armenian vassals, some of them Muslim, some of them Christian, that will exist over here as well. And because of their status as Armenian and also their Christian affiliation to Constantinople, there is a level of legitimacy that exists within this too. But keep in mind that the Armenians are also interacting with these Muslim lordships as well. So Muslims, Armenians, Byzantines, and all types of people like Syrians and shit like that, they are all interacting here to create this vassal buffer wall. The vassals, they get tribute from Constantinople in exchange for, of course, Constantinople aiding them, giving them a little bit of legitimacy, that sort of shit. In fact, we have a quote from a Alexander Daniel Bayhammer, who wrote the book Byzantium and the Emergence of Muslim Turkish Anatolia. In this quote, he basically talks about why it was so important for this Muslim vassal screen wall to exist, to prevent outside forces from taking over the newly conquered territories of the Byzantines. Quote, in the first 3 decades of the Byzantine-Turkish encounter, the political and military developments in question mostly affected the recently acquired territories east of the Anatolian Plateau, stretching from the Caucasus and the Pontus region over the Armenian highlands and the upper Euphrates provinces to Cilicia and northern Syria. Apart from the regions under direct Byzantine control, there was a broad sphere of imperial influence encompassing a network of Muslim vassal potentate in Azerbaijan, the Diyarbakir province, Syrian desert, and Aleppo. Now again, these vassals were great for a steady cash flow and also to make sure that the Byzantine Empire is safe from all threats. However, it was also a great weakness of the Byzantine Empire as well. As stated in Alexander Daniel Bayhammer's book on page 57, it talks about how the initial incursions of the Seljuks and the Turkomans, the undermining of this vassal system, is what essentially erodes Byzantine authority and allows for Muslim incursions and Muslim settlements into Byzantium. And once these Turkomans or Seljuks start to unravel this vassal network, we have Muslims, Syrians, Armenians, whole slew of different peoples now under the thumb of the Muslim Turkomans, essentially, who now create their own alliances and their own mercenary groups with these Turkic invaders. Now that we've talked about the history of Anatolia, the small history of Byzantium up until this point, we're now at the point where we have to talk about the Turks. Now, the Turks' origins, I think, like, when we have to start really far back into human history, we're gonna have to really put a little bit of constraint on ourselves here. We could go as far back as, of course, the Fancivinos or whatever, and then of course we have the let me see if my wrote it down on my card here, Andronovos. Now, these are 2 different early, like, human cultures that existed in this area that would come to be known for the Turkic people, actually. Andronovos are interesting as they're connected to something known as the Kurgan hypothesis. Kurgan hypothesis is essentially where the cultures in question that have kurgans, which are these structures created to bury dead, and they would be buried alongside their horses, their items, their all that shit. They would have a mound, and they would often, some of these kurgans later down the line in their development would have steles right next to them. These kurgan babals over here are steles, these like big, not like big, but like fairly well-sized stone structures that are carved into the likeness of a human being. Babal meaning grandfather or ancestor. This is a Kurgan babal, and this is like a later development babal. We're talking about like very earlier signs of kurgans, right? That the Anfansimvios and the Andronovos were a part of. But you see, we have to really like kind of like constrain ourselves, because yeah, we can go as far back as we want to into the history of Central Asia when we're talking about Neanderthals, but Anfansivios really just kind of like started at about 3000 BCE, and these guys, Andronovos, 2000 BCE. So there is like a shared possible connection in these like Kurgan, these cultures that use the kurgan, that would later use kurgan steles and stuff, that would create burial mounds known as tummuls. These peoples are connected as like one culture that kind of links back to also the Proto-Indo-Europeans. There's the theory that these peoples are connected to the Proto-Indo-Europeans under the Yamnaya, who also used kurgans. And actually, the Amphansevios are, I believe, directly connected to the Yamnaya as well, actually. Between these two peoples, essentially, and possible migration of Yamnaya into the Amphansevios when they entered this like Central Asian territory here. But again, I'm not going to go that far because that's a little bit like too stupid. Let's kind of keep it constrained here. The first time we really truly know about the Turks is, well, we could construct here a little genealogy of the different Turkic peoples. And what we know as Turks started between a split of two Turkic people, that being, of course, Göktürk and Dingling. The Dingling are kind of seen as the earliest form of Turkic peoples. Now, the Dingling are considered to be the earliest Turkic peoples, but they're often mistaken for another Turkic people, that being, of course, Tilei. Tilei, or in the Chinese sources, Gao Chi. And then, of course, Gao Ji, some shit like that. But essentially, the name of Tilei translates actually to high cart. High cart being a known vehicle being pulled by oxen and horses by these steppe nomads. This one over here is a Scythian cart, but these carts were used by the Dinglei, used by the Tilei, which translates to high cart, same as Gao Chi. Some have argued that Dingling, is a translation of wheel and hoop as well. So while Gao Chi and Tilei mean high cart, Dingling means wheel or hoop, which is synonymous with the high cart. Doesn't really matter. The point is that different sources, different Chinese sources, link Dingling and Tilei and Gao Chi together, all these names together. These were tribes, or these people, early Turkic people, quote unquote, were tribes of the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were the top dogs of the steppe at the time, and they essentially dominated this area, and Dingling and Tilei were one of the many sub-tribes of the Xiongnu. Now, when the Xiongnu fell apart, however, and this is of course due to Dingling interference, we would have a period of time where there were no steppe peoples occupying this nomadic space until, of course, the Hwan Khaganate. The Hwan Khaganate was another top dog right here, but they're not Turkic peoples. They're more like Mongolian and like different other types of like Asiatic peoples here. So we're still not at Turks, actually. We only get the Turks at the Göktürks. The Göktürks are considered, right, the true Turkic people, the true starting Turkic people. And that actually comes from the Göktürks of the Ashina clan. The Ashina clan being, of course, a royal, not royal dynasty, but like a royal family clan name. There were said to be like hundreds of Ashina family clans here. And this right here is their Tamga, which is represented as a mountain goat. A Tamga is like a banner or like a branding or something, So this is like the Ashina one. She-wolf myth, actually, right? We get like multiple different Turkic peoples have a she-wolf myth. And here's an earlier reference. Here's something I found on Wikipedia of the Tilei people. The Gao Chi have a mythological origin tied to the she-wolf. Quote, "The Book of Wei preserved the Gao Chi origin myth. According to legends, the Xiongnu Chan Yu had two daughters, both extremely beautiful. The people of the country all thought them to be spirits. The Chan Yu said, 'How could I find husbands for my daughters? I am going to give them to heaven.' Thereafter, at a desolate place in the north part of the country, he erected a high platform and placed his two daughters on top, saying, 'O heaven, please come and receive them yourself.' After 3 years, their mother wanted them back, but the Chan Yu said, 'You may not, their time is not yet up.' After another year, There was an old wolf who guarded the platform day and night, howling. It dug a hole underneath the platform and would not leave for a long time. The younger daughter said, "Our father put us here, wanting to give us to heaven. Now this wolf came here. It is probably a heavenly being sent by heaven." She was about to descend, approach the wolf, but her elder sister said in horror, "This is a beast! Do not bring disgrace to our parents." The younger sister did not listen to her. She descended and became the wolf's wife, gave birth to children. Later on they multiplied, formed a state, and this is why their people like to sing long songs with a drawn out voice similar to the howling of wolves. Wei Shu 103, translated by Inaba Minoru.
Now I want you to keep a tracker of the she-wolf mythology because it's going to come back a lot. But anywho, we really kind of like see the phasing out of Dingling at this point of time, as like the Tile actually becomes the word synonymous for Turk actually. So when you think of Tile, you do think of Turk. However, some have argued that like Dingling, Tile, Turk, Gauchi, all the same. So again, like this is kind of like a period of time where like it's not super well established, especially because Chinese sources are so different in this regard. So on this chart over here, as you can see here, Turk kind of separates from Göktürk to Dingling and Tile. Göktürk is again the most well-known and very well-established point of Turk. As you can see, it's in the name, Göktürk. And we see this on the Orkan stele. The Orkan stele is a very famous stele. It's not one that's like made for a kurgan. It's instead a gigantic stele meant to tell the deeds of two Turkic princes. Here's a passage from the Orkan stele.
To the east I have made campaigns as far as the Shantung plain and almost reached the sea. To the south I have made campaigns as far as Tokuz Irsin and almost reached Tibet. To the west I have made campaigns beyond Yangtze Ligis, the Pearl River, as far as Timur Kapig, the Iron Gate. To the north I have made campaigns as far to the land of the Yurbeyikus. To all these lands have I led the Turks. The forest of Mount Otikin has no foreign overlord. The forest of Mount Otikin is the place where the kingdom is held together. The Orkan stele.
Steles like these, this is one of the most earliest and most famous examples, but they're found throughout Asia actually. They are quite well populated. These Kurgan babals being the most, these Kurgan babals being very common, and also Kurgans themselves and Tumulis can be seen throughout all of Inner Asia actually. So you have like you see here that there was a development of culture in the background, and especially because you can consider Anfansivios and Andronovos being the first peoples to interact with horses alongside the Yamnaya, kind of like connect to this shared culture. But let's go ahead and move these guys out of the way because we should move on with the timeline here. Dingling the Tile lived under the Xiongnu, who established themselves in the 3rd century BCE, and then would continue to exist to about the 3rd century CE. So they existed for quite a long time actually. Oh, sorry, I fucked up. 2nd century. So the Xiongnu lasts for quite a while. But at about the 2nd century CE, you start to see it be disestablished, and you can actually see that Tile rebellions alongside Jianbei forces and like different tribal units will basically rebel against the Xiongnu and create the Jianbei Confederacy. But we're not going to include them because they're so short-lived. So there was a period of time where there was just no nomadic steppe activity in this area until the Ruhan Khaganate, which establishes themselves at 330 CE to 555 CE. And they're quite dominant too. One of their tribes being, of course, in the Ruhan Khaganate, the Göktürks in question. And it's from, yes indeed, what I said beforehand, the Göktürks rebelling against the Ruhan Khaganate that establishes them in 555 CE. And they go stupid and crazy. Between the two brothers of Bumen, and Ishtemi, they basically conquer all the way from the eastern tip of, I would say this is like Manchuria areas, shit like that. The northeastern edge of like basically what we could consider China, Mongolia, and Korea. And then all the way across to the western steppe here of the Black Sea. So you see like the Gökturks are massive here, right? Thanks to the hard work of both of these brothers. And when we talk about Turk, we have only been exclusively talking about the Gökturks here. The Tile and the Dingling are only considered having Turkic elements in them. But again, this is like kind of the thing, right? There's like Tile, Dingling, Tuji, multiple different like peoples that are kind of associated with Turkic activities in Chinese sources. But when it comes to nailing what is a Turk, Gökturks. I'm going to bring up a quote here from page 28 of Ju Yup Lee's book, what is it called? Turkic Peoples in World History here, where he basically argues that there are, first of all, that at this time period, the only Turk is the Gökturks, and that none of the future Turkic peoples that we will talk about descend from those Gökturks. Here's the quote.
The Turks intermixed with and Turkicized various indigenous groups across Eurasia, Uralic hunter-gatherers in northern Eurasia, Mongolic nomads in Mongolia, Indo-European speaking nomads and sedentary populations in Xinjiang, in Transoxania, Iran, Kazakhstan, and South Siberia, and Indo-European elements in the Byzantine subjects in Anatolia and Balkans.
This point is actually also disputed on page 37. So ultimately put, this is still something that's argued about in academia. So regardless, there's just a lot of terminology being thrown out here. Tile and Dingling are kind of like collective terms for Turk. Gökturks is the selective thing, you know. We have the Ashina, who are a specific like clan of the Gökturks as well, who have their own mythology. Also, I made a bit of a mistake here. Let me do 250 BCE to, what is that, 100 CE? Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know why I decided to write in word and then numbers there, but that was just dumb. But anywho, regardless, this is kind of like a good period of time here that we're like talking about, where the Gökturks are basically just dominating. And really, they take a lot of their imperial ambition from the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu are considered not, well, you see, they do have Turkic elements. In fact, the Eurasian steppe is considered like the prime location for nomadic pastoralists. It's a very good place to just settle, chill out with your camels, your sheep, your horses, your cattle, all that stuff, and move from place to place on this Eurasian steppe land here. The proto-Turks of the Tile, Dingling, and all these other things, were just the latest of a series of nomadic pastoralists that lived in this area, and the Xiongnu happily had them live there. They basically lived in these like felt yurts, these like yurts that were covered in like felt and like wood that could be like moved from place to place. But the Xiongnu are, because of their like imperial focus, are considered to be the emulation. This is what all Turkic cognates will emulate. The Xiongnu will emulate the Xiongnu's imperial ambitions. So whenever you see a nomadic pastoralist people transition to imperial dominated like empire focused, empire building people, you have to thank the Xiongnu for that. You can see here that how it transitions, and we'll actually come to know that Gökturk also later splits off as well and goes from Oghuz and like different peoples here. The of course Khazars are right here as well. But we're getting a little too ahead of ourselves here. Just like so you're aware of what I'm talking about in terms of Turk terminology here. Carter Finley, on page 35, we talk about how the Xiongnu kind of slip into Chinese dependency. And so because of that, become weakened themselves. And that leads to the Ruan basically, well, the rebellions that lead to the Ruan being able to establish themselves. Regardless, in all of Chinese sources, if you were a high cart user, you were typically, you know, if you were a user of this big vehicle right here, you were typically associated with the Tile or the Turks or whatever the fuck. It's all the same to them when you use this guy. And actually, there is a funny mythology that again ties into the she-wolf myth for the Gok Turks here. And here's a quote on page 37 of Carter's book. Quote,
"In this myth, the Turks who founded the first Turkish Empire, the Turk Khaganate, on the Orkhon River in 552 CE were a separate tribe of the Xiongnu, bearing the family name Ashina, or Ashina. The enemies defeated and destroyed all the Ashina except for a 10-year-old boy whose feet they cut off. A she-wolf saved him, feeding him meat. He grew up and mated with her. Learning that the boy was still alive, the neighboring king again sent troops to destroy him. The she-wolf escaped to a mountain cave near Turfan in what is now the Xinjiang province. Inside the cave was a large grassy plain surrounded by mountains. Hiding in those mountains, the wolf gave birth to 10 boys, each of whom grew up, married a woman from outside, and had children. Each child took a family name, one of them taking the name Ashina. After several generations, they emerged from the cave and became the subjects of the Ruhan, working for them as ironsmiths." Carter 37.
so that's already 2 Turkic mythology myths. We've got 2 here. Let me just write it in. We've got 2 right here, 2 separate ones. Now, the wolf is tied to, of course, the concept of the Bori. The Bori are tied to the ruler's bodyguard. So the wolf is meant to represent loyalty of the bodyguard in question of the wolf itself because it's tied to this. So we have many different stories that connect to wolves, but also to the Ashina clan of the Gok Turks. The Ashina clan, it is said that they occupy 500 families. So ultimately, this is a big group of people that are undoubtedly Turks, but they may have had an Indo-European origin as well. It is said that the Ashina clan, right, the name Ashina is the Eastern Iranic word for blue. So there's an East Indo-European like origin for the Ashina clan, maybe a mixed race origin. Now earlier when the Gok Turks were under all of these different steppe peoples, they're considered, when you say Turk, it means only Gok Turk, right? And then like Tile, Dingling is like the, you know, common word for Turkic people or Turkic-like people. However, right, once the Gok Turks are fully established, the term Turk is used to describe all these people now. So now you're not saying like high cart, you're not saying like wheeled people, you're just saying Turk because of the Gok Turks here. Notice their flag, how it's a green wolf and a blue background. I think this is like their banner or whatever. Blue.
Now we talk about the Gok Turks here. So at about 552 CE, so we'll write that down right here, 552 CE, we got the establishment of the Gok Turks in question. And from there, we know that they established what we know as Pax Turkia. So I'll write that down in, let me see, let's have a better color here. Pax Turkia. So this would basically be a period of time where the Gok Turks are essentially establishing trade routes all the way from China to Byzantium, basically. And they're basically able to corral a huge chunk of the nomadic population in a fairly well-established system, right? So at the top, you have what we know as the inner tribes. They are the head honchos. This is the ruling dynasty as well as the in-laws dynasty, right? So these are like the 2 tribes or like the few tribes and families that exist up here. This is where the, for example, in the Gok Turks, the Ashina family would exist, right? or the Ashina families. That's where they would be, right? Underneath them would be kind of like a subsect of tribes known as the willing tribes. These are tribes of Turkic peoples and nomadic peoples that accept the inner tribe's rule and domination, okay? So this is like a consensual sort of like domination, right? Completely consensual, right? So they're able to rule their existing lands with their existing leadership without any fear, right? And any like issue, correct? Then, of course, you have the unwilling tribes. And these tribes typically are done by conquest. And oftentimes the ruling leadership usually replaced from someone from the Ashina tribe in this case, or from someone in the inner tribes, someone that you could trust, you know, that won't rebel against you. Underneath all of these nomadic and Turkic peoples are the sedentary folk. You know, you get goods from them, you tax them, you bully them because they can't fight back. Kind of how the whole nation, or the whole empire of the Gog Turks really forms. 552 CE, things are chill up until 581, right? And we'll use this shade of green. 581 CE, we have a civil war that breaks out. And this is basically caused by the nobles who are jockeying for the title of Khagan, splits up the Gog Turks into different states, different fights. And there's a brief reunification in 603 CE, so things are chill, we're unifying. Alright, civil war, unify. But then later in 603 CE, we have a division. So now the Gog Turks are split between the west and the east. Maybe I'll do a different marker for that one. So now there's a western and eastern half of the Gog Turks. And they more or less are chilling for a long period of time. Of course, these two halves of the Gog Turk empires will have their own issues. And I don't want to get too bogged down here, but you have to understand that like we're covering a long span of time, so I don't want to get too bogged down here. But essentially the Gog Turks, right, they're facilitating these like trade routes. This migration of Turks is also happening under them. This Turkifying of these lands are also happening, and also they're dividing up the empire into two halves, right? This won't work out, and eventually, you know, shit hits the fan, leading to, of course, the second Turkic Khaganate, or the second Gog Turk Khaganate, at about 682 to about 744 CE. Now, the second Turkic Khaganate would only last about 744 CE because of the Uyghur Khaganate, which formed from a coalition of Tile tribes, yes, the High Karts, right? They only formed from a coalition of Tile tribes called the Tohuz Oghuz, which are 9 tribes of the Tile. In fact, Tohuz means 9. Here we have a quote actually that is written from the Kultigan Steles actually. Here, quote, 9 Oghuz people were my own people. Because of the sky being jumbled up with the earth, they became my enemy. And actually, funny enough, the oldest written Turkic languages predating the Orkan stele actually would exist within the second Turkic Khaganate. Now the Uyghur Khaganate would only last for about 744 CE to 840 CE and would be quite a dominant power in the area. Here, let me write that down here. 744 to about 840 CE. So the Uyghurs are now the top nomadic dogs in this area. Gog Turks are now under the Tile once again. Now the Uyghurs won't last long, as they will be supplanted by another Turkic group, the Kyrgyz, which basically will start a chain reaction in which Turkic groups will now move westward from their Mongolian ancestral lands, right? So these lands that they shared with the Mongolians, they will move westward towards the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea area. And in fact, this had been happening from since the time of the Xiongnu, actually. Over here, we have a map of the migration patterns of Turkic people moving into Siberia, the Balkan areas, Europe, the Caucasias, through Iran and Anatolia, where I'm spoiling myself, and also into China and Northeastern Asia area. I believe this is in Turkish. Hint Okonyanosu. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and put you right there. So this image would also be a clearer image of Turkic migrations. Here we see the early Proto-Turkic homeland and the late Proto-Turkic homeland. So we're probably meaning like the Tile, Dingling, all that shit. We see their movement through Northern Eurasia, Greenbelt, into the Great Steppe and all that stuff. And you're seeing like the major routes of Turkic peoples too. So we're going to put that right... Sure, let me see on my camera where I can put it. Now, even so, Turkic peoples have been moving westward for a long period of time, actually, since, of course, Xiongnu, and have been Turkifying the Iranian groups or the non-Turkic groups that were there. So all these like nomadic people that have been living on the steppe for a long period of time on the Great Steppe in this like area here, they are being Turkified right now. And that process is a very complex process of Turks moving into the area, adapting, but also changing the people there. Now, this concept of Turkification is really complex. For example, the Oghuz Turks, they have non-Turkic origins, but they themselves became Turkified and then afterwards went on to Turkifying other non-Turkic peoples. So you see this with the Oghuz, and this is a good time to now bring up the Oghuz, actually.
All right, so this is a map of our question at hand, where the Turks come from. So we're going to map out their migration to Anatolia. First and foremost, let's talk about those Oghuz, shall we? So, like I showed off previously in my in this Turkic diagram here, we have Turk, which typically comes from Gökturk, or, of course, Dingling, which often is confused with Tile or co-associated or mistranslated. All you have to understand is Dingling is theorized by the way, I'm not endorsing this, is theorized to be a translation of the wheel, okay? Whereas Tile from Chinese sources translates to high cart. Therefore, that's why the association is there, right? I mean, like, what the fuck can you do with a wheel, right? So we have Dingling, Tile, then we have like the peoples underneath them, the different Turkic peoples here. Some of the Dingling and Tile branch will be like something like the Uyghurs, for example, the Bulgars, for example. Gökturks, however, will branch off, create the Oghuz, for example. These are the Turkic peoples that are kind of like the main characters of the Turkic world. They don't have any association with the Gökturks. As I stated previously, the Oghuz have non-Turkic routes, became Turks from Turkification, and now are spreading Turkic culture. That is the Oghuz sort of like origin story. There we go. And you know, Oghuz won't be alone. They'll be joined by the Karlaks, for example. They'll be joined by the Khazars, for example. But the Oghuz, however, will split off and branch into different Turkic families too. One of those being the Seljuks. So this is basically the Turk family tree. You start from Turk, you giga evolve into Oghuz, and then you evolve into Gökturk, and then you evolve into Oghuz, then you evolve into Seljuks and Ottomans. Right here in the Proto-Turkic homeland, and they move out really, right? It starts right here in this Central Asian, in this Inner Asian steppe land. The Oghuz get Turkified. From the 9th and 10th century, they chill out in this Caspian Aral Sea area. So the Oghuz were theoretically part of a confederation before their state in the Caspian Aral Sea of like 20 tribes. This, of course, had the top tribes of the Kaya and the Kinnik. Kaya and Kinnik. So these would be the top tribes, right, of the 20 tribes that the Oghuz were a part of, okay? So that's like the Oghuz origin story. They are these small fish in the big ocean. Fuck. They're really part of these new Turkic people that are part of this process of Turkification that are moving westward. They move via Khorasan and into Iran and Anatolia. So really their migration can be more like here, if we call it that. There was an Oghuz state that existed in the Aral Sea and like Caspian Sea area. It's called the Oghuz Yabuz state. But it was very much a separate entity, not a continuation of like all these later Turkic peoples like the Seljuks, the Ottomans that we'll get into later. But that's the route that these Turkic peoples are going through. They are going to Anatolia this way, making their way from the little horsey that I drew and moving all the way here. Now, the peoples that live here, however, they're going to have some interesting things to say about these Turks. Turkic people before the advent of Islam worship Tengriism, right? That's where the whole Turkic wolf myths that we've been talking about are coming from. They're coming from Tengri. When the Turks are encountering the Muslims, okay, and this will start to happen after the Battle of Talis between the Tang dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate. It's a very small piece of history, but it's part of a larger encompassing like part of Turkic history where the Turks become Muslim. And they don't convert like slowly. The Turks are converting en masse to Islam and are connecting themselves with the Islamic states here. And we'll go into why there's an Oghuz state from the 9th and 10th century in a little bit. Why these Turks are able to migrate from Khorasan all the way to Anatolia. I gotta take a piss. Leave the footage off the camcorder. We're gonna have to redo this part of the video. So this is going to be the Islamic period of the Turkic people, so to speak. And we're going to talk about like the introduction into the Islamic world, right? The Islamic world being, of course, the lands owned by the Muslim sultanates and kingdoms that basically ruled in this area. We are living right now in what we know as the Iranian intermezzo. I'm going to show up a picture of the map right here. You see the most powerful Iranian independent states here. That being, of course, the Samids, the Buyids, the Salarids, right? The Zirids. And these Iranian states recently broke away from the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphate is located in Iraq and was owning most of the Middle East and the Islamic world at the time, but had slowly reduced in power, allowing for these Iranian states to break free. And this is the first time that we see not only Iranian Muslim states that are independent, but also just independent states from the Abbasid Caliphate in general. And the Buyids would actually conquer the Abbasids and take over Baghdad. So you see that the Abbasids are now relegated to a figurehead status over Islam and not controlling the Islamic world anymore. Yeah, the Fatimids over here in Egypt, but for now they don't really play a pivotal role in our story. We'll write down Fatimids because world building and stuff. Fatimids. And then we, of course, have the Iranian intermezzo. We're just going to label it smack dab right here because this is the world that we're really talking about. Seljuks would be the one of the Oghuz Turk peoples, and I'll write down where the Oghuz are. They'll be one of the Oghuz Turk peoples that will conquer the Middle East. But for now, we won't really discuss the Seljuks actually. Instead, we will talk about Karakanid Khaganate actually, that will expand from Central Asia eastward and become one of the first Muslim Turkic states actually. Now the Karakanids, later on into the video, we will be talking about their founder called Alp-Ir-Tunga. I want you guys to remember this name. It will be very important for what we will talk about later on in the future of the video in question. Now, the Karakanid Khaganate has its origins with Karloks.
Karloks, okay, or Karluks, had basically been escaping the Uyghur Khaganate and were part of the many different Turkic peoples that were moving westward from Eastern Asia over here. This like Mongolian steppeland area here that we see in the old Turkic homelands. They are one of the many Turkic peoples that are moving westward, following the Uyghur Khaganate pushing them out. Now the Karluks will own territory of the Western Göktürk Empire, right, or the Göktürk Khaganate. So because of that, they'll gain a little bit of legitimacy of ruling over these lands, and also their connection to the Ashina clan that I talked about previously. So because of that, they have an heir of legitimacy that puts them above different groups in this area, right? So they rule the northern steppe here, while the Samids rule this like southern steppe. So you can see that the Samids own these territories. They go up north as far as the Sea of Aral here in Samarkand and Bukhara and stuff, but they are mostly out of the steppe lands. That's where the Oghuz Turks, the Karluks and stuff, that's where they own essentially. Now in this northern area, right, we have the city of Tarax. We'll write that down in red, right? Now, the Samids take over the city of Tarax. They basically convert the local church there into a mosque because the Karluks were actually Christians at the time, Zoroastrian Christians, and had basically taken over this city that was essentially an headquarters of the Karluk peoples here. So this was a major escalation of conflict from the Samanid Empire, right? Now, because of this escalation, Karluks and other tribes will then form the Kara-Khanid Khaganate, right? This confederation of different tribes will be founded right then and there. And at about 960, we will see the mass conversion of these tribes people to Islam. In fact, it said on my little index card here that about 200k Turks convert to Islam, or 200k tents as said in the source, which could house more individuals, of course. So we've got some shit going on with the nomadic Turks here that are independent. Then, of course, we have the Ghaznavids, okay? The Ghaznavids actually have their origins from the Samanid Empire. They are essentially a Turkic military family who serve under the Ghaznavids, part of a long lineage and tradition of Islamic powers using Turkic soldiers as weapons of war, right? These slave soldiers will convert to Islam and serve the Sultan or the state in whatever means they want, right? Page 25 of Ju Yupli's book goes into how the Ghaznavids are basically subservient to the Samids and their role in the acquisition of Turkic soldiers, as Turkic soldiers are seen as some of the best and the best fighting forces of the world at this time, actually, and are seen as the best in the Islamic world as well. The Turkic peoples also played important roles in the Islamic world as slave soldiers known as Mamluks or Gulams. Turkic slave soldiers became a major component of Muslim armies from the 9th century CE during the Abbasid period and gradually seized political control of many Muslim polities. As a result, many commanders of Mamluk origin succeeded in establishing provincial dynasties, including the Mamluk sultans of Egypt and northern India. Page 25 also has another quote that backs up the Turkic military dominance in the Islamic world. Quote, "The reason that the Turks and other Turkic nomads were formidable warriors was that they were horse archers. A horse archer specifically denotes a mounted warrior armed with a bow who can shoot from horseback while riding. Turkic nomadic warriors, as well as the Mongols, used a composite bow which was made of horn, wood, and sinew. The composite bow was more accurate, had a better range and rate of fire than muskets and early firearms. The tactical principles of the Turkic horse archers were based on combination of firepower and mobility. Nomadic horse archers shot in volleys, weakening the enemy before they charged. Ideally, they practiced firepower in movement like modern armies. Other things were being equal. The horse archers were often almost unbeatable on the open battlefields. Against them, sedentary soldiers were often helpless until the development of efficient battlefield handguns, including repeating rifle or firearms. The firearms that could be fired repeatedly before being manually reloaded in the 17th century." We also have a quote here that really goes into that detail as well. So you see, over time, this knowledge of Turkic prowess, right, with the bow, that of course, what we know as Parthian shot, is something famously taught
to all nomadic peoples, regardless of origin. The Parthian shot is a famous technique in which a rider would take their bow and arrow, right? Turn 180 degrees on their horse, right? And then fire said arrow, having no hands on the reins whatsoever. So it requires a good amount of control with your hips and legs, control obviously with your upper body to fire a bow and firing it behind you, and also trust in the animal as well. So the Karluks and, well, the Parthians invent the Parthian shot, but the Karluks, the Oghuz, all these different nomadic Turkic people were horse archer people. So oftentimes you will see Parthian shot or parting shot. That way, of course, you don't really have to designate it with a Parthian affiliation. So the Ghaznavids were also jockeying with another Turkic military family that were providing slave soldiers for the Samids. That being, of course, the Simjarids. Now, the Simjarids and the Ghaznavids are basically jockeying for control of Khorasan over here. They want control of Khorasan. Why, you may ask? So that they could have a hand in placing the next emir in the Samanid state, because the Samanid Empire was soon going to be involved in a succession crisis between brothers. So they wanted a hand in being able to choose the future emir. That requires a seat at governorship of Khorasan. Now, so basically, there's the problem. The Karakhanid and the Ghaznavids at about late 10th century will start their offensives and rebellions against the Samanids, and they'll basically be able to swallow them up between the two of them. The Karakhanids existing in Central Asia exclusively, and the Ghaznavids existing in this Iranian area, so to speak, mostly. The Karakhanid Sultanate is considered the first Muslim Turkic empire or state in Central Asia, okay? And so because of this, it's basically the blueprint for all the future states moving forward. And it will link Persianite culture with Turkic peoples, making the two inseparable actually. And this will lead to all future Turkic peoples, including Persianite culture with their Turkic military culture. So you see here that civilization is now split into two. We have the Chad steppe military, like Turkic peoples, who are known as the Turks, of course. And then we have over here the Persianite civilian people. And this is very famously explained in page 106 of the Turkic Peoples and World History. These settled populations were called Sarts or Tajiks. Similar Turkic Persianite structures extended to Iran and India via nomadic conquerors including Seljuks, Ghaznavids, Chingizids, and Timurids. An old Turkic proverb in Karakhanid Kashgari illustrates this symbiosis. Just as there is no cap without a head, there is no Turk without a tact. That's basically how it's all set up, but we're gonna still progress here because in 985, okay, we have the Seljuks that are going to convert to Islam. At about 985 CE, the Seljuks convert to Islam, okay? And they are part, again, of the many Oghuz Turks, actually, that are migrating westward. This is another group of them. Now, they will actually support the Samanids when the Karakhanids and the Ghaznavids are doing their, rebelling in their territories here. And they'll support the last Samanid emir, actually. Now, the Seljuks are basically established by brothers Tughril and Changri. They co-rule and basically beat the shit out of the Ghaznavids and Karakhanids, conquering the Ghaznavids, vassalizing the Karakhanids. Now, the Seljuks will basically, after dominating these two powers, will then go after the rest of the states of the Iranian intermezzo and conquer them too. So you see that the Abbasid Caliphate is once again back to a figurehead state, this time under the thumb of course, the Seljuk Empire. So the Seljuks now stretch from all the way to the east and Central Asia, all the way westward to Anatolia. And this is where we get back to the Byzantine Empire. Now, on page 75 of Byzantium and the emergence of Turkish Anatolia, we talk about Ibrahim Yanal and Tughril, who are the now new
well, I think Tugril was the previous ruler, but Tugril Beg and Ibrahim Yanal are now the current rulers of the Seljuk Empire. And after conquering western Iran, they will now direct their attention towards Anatolia, actually. Now, Ibrahim Yanal becomes very interested in the Roman Empire, in the Eastern Roman Empire, in the Byzantine Empire. And Oghuz Turks, who are continuing to move westward now, are basically told by Ibrahim Yanal to go to Anatolia. Here's the quote. "My territories are too narrow to offer you space to settle and to prove you with what you need. My opinion is that you should go to raid the Romans and strive on the path of God and make booty. I will follow behind you and aid you in your enterprise." This comes to us at about year 1048 or about 1049. And that's basically it of this section of the video. There's going to be a hard cut to the previous version of the video, so sorry that it's a little abrupt. But so where we left off after I was taking my piss was at 1040 CE. We have the Battle of Dan Khan, which is essentially the Seljuks skill diffing the Ghaznavids, which I have removed off the map because they are gone now. So we now get on to 1048 right here, where our source, our quote, talks about how the Seljuks are trying to instigate the Oghuz Turks into moving into Anatolia, into the Byzantine Empire. And behind them, the Seljuks will be aiding them, actually. So this push by the Oghuz is in part being supported by the Seljuks themselves. And it's at this point now that we kind of draw our attention to away from Asia, all of West Asia, and we head on towards Asia Minor to Byzantium, because now the Turks are moving in 1048 and they're going to wreck shit. So in 1048, the Oghuz Turks needed a new outlet. They needed new sources of income and they needed new sources of employment, new sources to raid. And that would be found in Byzantium, especially when using the concept of jihad, which is when Muslim forces can move into non-Muslim lands and be able to pillage them as they see fit. This isn't the meaning of jihad, but this is the meaning of jihad in a geopolitical sort of sense. In a, how do I direct this horde of Turks to what location to fight in? And Asia Minor is that location. Now, because of this, the Oghuz Turks are able to establish some sort of rival vassal network with that of Constantinople. And they're able to essentially have vassals from Syria all the way to Azerbaijan. Now, the issue comes is that Byzantium doesn't really fuck around or care about what the Turks are doing at this point in time. They've got their own issues to worry about, which I will talk about later. But basically, they only actually start to give a shit when they will be attacked up north, when their most important and valuable vassal is attacked up north. That would be King Bagrut IV of Georgia. I have his coinage right here. Now, King Bagrut IV is not only an extremely powerful man in the Caucasus region, but he's also vital for the Byzantine vassal network that was existing here. Because without him, basically the ability to regain the vassals that the Byzantines have lost to the Turks under the Seljuks is completely nullified. This man was kind of an intermediary between different groups of people: Armenians, Christians, Georgians, Muslims, Turks, and now that's completely upset by his removal and by the Seljuks installing their own vassalages over the provinces that King Bakrut had owned. So essentially, the Byzantines are cut off and they're never going to be able to get them back because their main man in this area is completely gone. Now, this is a huge problem, and Turkish raids into Byzantium will continue and continue without stoppage. In 1068 CE, the Turks are able to push deep into Asia Minor. Now, Constantinople will attempt to send out their own forces to try and quell the Turkish advance, but they're completely unable to do so, as individual armies being sent out to Constantinople is not really a good substitute to the vassal screen that Byzantium had in the past, where they could rely upon a host of vassals from Syria all the way to the Caucasus. And this borderland area between the Byzantine and Oghuz, Turk, and Seljuk lands are basically depopulated and ravaged at this point. They are complete wastelands because of all this conflict. It's here enter Romanus Diogenes IV. He basically is going to inherit the Byzantine Empire, and shit's not going well for him. Here's a quote on page 145 where it talks about some rebellious nail-dwearers under his boot. The collapse of the Byzantine military structures was further accelerated by the revolt of Crispin, a mercenary commander from Italy who, like Frangopolius in the 1050s, felt insufficiently rewarded by the imperial government for his services. Sent to secure the sections of Armenia con Demata, the districts of Kolinia, Sebastia, and Amesia, he began to rob tax collectors and others. So you see that rebels like Crispin, Ruziel, the Feleritos, Brachemios, they defied the central government and established their own regional control over the center of action, or the radius of control that they have. So territories are basically being taken from the Byzantines and made into independent states, essentially. And I'll have some of those displayed on screen. And I won't lie to you, shit does not go well for Romanus at all. He's alienated the Ducas family, who are tied to the Byzantine aristocracy, especially to his junior co-emperor, which is a huge problem. He's alienated the Vanagarian Guard. He puts himself at the head of the army so that the government has total focus on the army at hand. And the army is in very bad shape. Like, first and foremost, his predecessor, Constantine V, basically disbanded 50,000 Armenian militiamen. So 50,000 Armenians could have been right here to fight off all these Turks. Okay, we're talking 50K, and they're gone, right? They're completely disbanded, and the army itself is not looking too good. As opposed to being made up of mostly Byzantines or Greek people, it's actually made up of mercenaries, auxiliaries that are either Normans, Latins, they might be Armenians, they might be Seljuk, Turks, and like Pitchings and all these other different groups of people. So the Byzantine army is not doing good. It's ill-equipped, it's ill-disciplined. Oftentimes, you have commanders that are trying to eke out their own existence. His predecessor also ballooned the monthly the earnings of the military administration. So when our boy over here, Romanus, lowers the income of the administration of the military, they start getting alienated too, and they start not fucking with this guy as well. So what ends up happening is that Romanus is basically at the head of a host of units that are basically Slavonian, Armenian, Bulgarian, Frankish troops who don't give a fuck about the Roman Empire, and he's being constantly maneuvered by the Turks. There are some campaigns where he's successful. He's able to take a city in Syria named Heraclopolis or whatever the fuck it's called, but ultimately, every time this man tries to get the Turks in a position to kill them, trapping them in the mountains of Asia Minor, they end up always getting away. They always drop the booty and just fuck off out of there. So he's never able to get a decisive advantage. Again, if he had the vassal screen, the Turks wouldn't have such free reign over Asia Minor to begin with. Now, in the latest Turkish-Byzantine clash, we have, of course, Alp Arslan. Alp Arslan has been ruling under the Seljuks for quite a long time. He basically is kicking some Byzantine ass, and more or less though, the Byzantines and the Turks, there's a lot of raiding, a lot of maneuvering, right? Alp Arslan's boy over here gets captured by the Byzantines, and it launches Alp Arslan to attempt to attack the Byzantines because of this alliance, but the Byzantines want to negotiate a land trade. They want to trade a Syrian city for some Armenian territories. Now, Alp Arslan actually is completely cool with this. You see, the Seljuks have to battle and jockey for dominance of the Islamic world with what we know as the Fatimids. The Fatimids are down here. I'll draw them out, but they don't really have much of a role in this story. Fatimids. So the Fatimid Caliphate are dominating in Egypt, and they control a huge chunk of land, and they are the primary rivals of the Seljuks. Just like how the Fatimids were the rivals of the Buyids when the Buyids were the most dominant Islamic power. And so now Alp Arslan wants to deal with the Fatimids, all right? He's had his fun with the Romans. The Oghuz Turks have their fill of booty. Let's go fight the Fatimids now. So while they are attempting to negotiate, he finds out that Romanus is playing him for a fool. Romanus is marching. Okay, let me remove you, Mr. Bagrot. So Romanus is marching actually with his army up north. He's going up north to attack the fortress known as this is on the Manzikert plain actually, but he's gonna attack a fortress at Manzikert. Manzikert is just one of these like many different like fortresses or whatever, these like different plains over here that like just exist. It has strategic value obviously in it being a fort and in it controlling like a huge area. By the way, this is not like to scale, so don't think this is where Manzikert actually exists. Constantinople is the scale though. But basically, Manzikert is just an area that the Romanus is trying to take back control of this Armenian territory. Now, Alp Arslan finds out about this, and he starts moving to Manzikert as well. Let's move him right here. He starts moving to Manzikert as well. Now, the funny thing is that the Byzantines don't know that Alp Arslan is on his way to Manzikert. And so a series of unfortunate things happen. First and foremost, the German forces in Romanus's army are rebelling and looting the area as they do. So he has to wrestle control with them. Then he splits his army up. One half is going to a different stronghold, the other is attacking Manzikert. At a critical point in time, Romanus gets outmaneuvered. In Jonathan Harris's book, Intro to Byzantium, 602 to 1453 CE, he's going to really explain what happens in this quote. So hear this quote out. The unexpected outcome could have been the result of simple bad luck, for it was very easy for battles to go wrong on the day. In the initial clash, the Turks pulled back before the Byzantine onslaught and were pursued. After a time, the emperor called a halt to the chase and ordered the banners to be turned around to signal a withdrawal. Unfortunately, the soldiers at the rear read this as a sign that the vanguard has been defeated. They panicked, started to flee. That gave the Turks a chance to come between the vanguard and the main body of the army, overwhelming and capturing the emperor. Yeah, so Manzikert is not a good battle whatsoever. The Seljuks completely crushed the Turks, capture Romanus. Most of Romanus's forces are running away. I mean, you see this picture over here. Romanus is just before the Turks here, before Alp Arslan and his forces. It is not a good sight, and he's humiliated before all of these guys, and he's ransomed off. But then after he's ransomed off, I mean, the Sultan just goes back to what he was doing. He was going to fight the Fatimids anyway, and 1 year later, Alp Arslan is killed anyway regardless. So Alp Arslan doesn't matter, and there was no greater Seljuk threat to Byzantium whatsoever. If it was just going to end here, and Romanus, you know, goes back to Constantinople and takes it back over, I don't think anybody would be talking about Manzikert. We're talking about Manzikert because everything went wrong right after it. First and foremost, the Dukas family took control of Constantinople, which is fucked. They usurp him with Michael VII. Shut up. So Michael VII takes over, and he is, well, going to basically lie to Romanos IV that they're going to send him to a monastery and he can live out his days peacefully. They blind him, and it doesn't work out, and he dies. So he's dead, and so now all hail Michael VII. Although on page 181, there's a good quote on how he's doing, actually. Quote, Michael VII soon revealed himself to be too inexperienced and naive to deal with the crisis. Real power soon passed into the hands of others. First his uncle, Caesar John Ducas, then a eunuch called Nicephorus, who did attempt to resolve the situation with refugees crowding into Constantinople from Asia Minor. Nicephorus attempted to maintain the food supply by taking control of the grain market, stockpiling corn at the port of Rheiadestos. There were unfortunate economic results. The price of grain skyrocketed. Workers demanded higher wages in order to be able to pay for it. Matters were compounded by the fact that the nomisma had lost a great deal of its value thanks to debasement, while the tax revenues from Asia Minor were dwindling as the Byzantines lost control of the area. So now we've got the Byzantine Empire hot potato. The first off, we've got Michael VII from Constantinople, but about 1077 CE, we got Nicephorus Bryennos as Emperor of Adrianople, and then Nicephorus Botaniatas, who is the Emperor of Asia Minor. So keep that in mind. I know they're sharing the same name. They're not related though. He's related to the Ducas family though. There is also in 1075 a revolt by the Petchings in the Byzantine Empire as well. So you've got to deal with a bunch of Turkic people running around here. 1078, Michael VII abdicates and becomes a monk. So goodbye, Michael VII. We'll write you down there. Because of Michael abdicating the throne, Nicephorus Botaniatas moves on to Constantinople and then becomes Nicephorus III and becomes Emperor of the Byzantine Empire. And here, let's usher in Nicephorus III with his likeness. That's his likeness right there in beautiful Byzantine artwork, Nicephorus III. He's a bit of an old fuck, so like ultimately he's not going to be out in campaign and he's not very that popular. So because of that, about 1078, we have Nicephorus Lakios. Nicephorus Basilakios becomes basically Emperor of the Balkans in 1078. But he's essentially crushed by Nicephorus III's general. And we will write him down right now. His name will be, of course, Alexios Komnenos. That is Nicephorus III's general, Alexios Komnenos, who crushes Nicephorus Basiletus in 1078. Then in 1081, we have Nicephorus, I know, another one, Nicephorus Milesianos. Whoever's Greek, help me pronounce this shit in the comments. He will take over as Emperor of Asia Minor in 1081 CE. So you've got another Byzantine claimant over here. But a few months later, that doesn't matter because Alexios Komnenos basically takes over as the emperor. So he will completely unseat Nicephorus III and replace himself as emperor. God damn it, right here, emperor. So now Alexios Komnenos owns this entire area. This civil war between all of these Byzantine claimants leads to Armenians, Latins, and Turks taking over the power vacuum. So you will see different Turkic states, you will see Armenian states, you will see Armenian states carving out their own sphere of influence here. Latins like Rousseau will take over in Asia Minor. So we have like little like rebel states over here in the middle of Byzantine territory. Of course, we have the independent Armenian kingdoms here that'll last to about the 14th century. And really, actually, let's increase the Armenian territory here. Technically, it was huge. It was stretching from Armenia somewhat all the way to Syria, but obviously stopping around Antioch area. Then we get to the Turks under the Danish Mendids. Here, I'll write their name out. Danish Mendids. It's kind of spelled Danish Mendids. I don't even know, honestly. They basically set up a state in Asia Minor, and then in the west of Asia over here, another Turkic state is developed. It's led by a Seljuk commander by the name of Suleiman ibn Kutulmus, who's basically cousin of Alp Arslan, actually. He takes controls of Byzantine towns over here while aiding Nicephorus Botaniatas. But because Nicephorus Botaniatas doesn't come back to take back his towns, he just takes them over. This happens all in 1081, essentially.
And now in Nicaea, the Turks over here will now call themselves the Sultans of Rum. Basically, somewhat ends the Byzantines over here in Asia Minor, right? As like more and more of Asia Minor is being carved up by these different powers here. Foreign powers like the Latins, previous vassals like the Armenians, and now newcomers like the Turks. Asia Minor is slowly going to the foreigners. On page 162 of the Grand Strategy of the Byzantine Empire, there's a very good quote that I'm going to briefly show off that'll summarize everything that's happened so far. Quote, and that leads us nicely to the Sultanate of Rum. Asia Minor fully belongs to the Turks at this moment. Byzantium owns a very small sliver of territory left, if any at all, and they're mostly relegated to the Balkans and Constantinople. But that won't last for long as we continue on our story of Anatolia and the Turks. Now, the nightmare doesn't end for the Byzantine Empire, as more groups are actually coming into Anatolia while all this madness with the Sultanate of Rum is happening. We've got a few groups actually that are now making settlements here. We have, of course, the Seljukids, we have the Mengucheks, and then we have the Aftukids. And I'll write that down right now. These new peoples will settle in the different areas of Anatolia. Seljukids will go to Irizim. Mengucheks will go into Erzincan, and Aftukids will spawn in Diyarbakir. So we have like more groups settling here. And on top of that, the Sultan of Rum is expanding in all directions, as you can see, beating the crap out of Christian and Muslim rulers alike. Hell, they'll be battling the Crusaders actually in the First Crusade as well. So these guys over here are going against it, pushing against the Byzantine Empire. This map is now completely outdated because, you know, they don't even control that much anymore in Anatolia, and that guy is completely dead. So we have a new reality for the Byzantines now being pushed out of Asia Minor and getting the help of Crusaders coming in to fight the Sultanate of Rum for the Byzantines. Now, like I said, this whole environment here is mixed with Armenians, Arabs, we've got Jews, we've got Christians of all ethnicities, and now we have Muslim Turks intermixed with already established Muslims in this area. So it's a mess. The Sultanate of Rum will establish a system of marches known as bays to control the frontiers of their territories here. So you see these like frontier areas where they're battling the Byzantines in the western area of their borders and the western half of Anatolia. That's where the bays would function, around their border areas, even in the east as well in the south. These areas will be functioning kind of like lords, right? They will swear fealty to the Sultan in exchange for money and military support. Now write that down right in here, bays, which is effectively European marches. Now, this system of bays, right, will be under the thumb of the Sultan of Rum for now. However, that changes in 1243 at the Battle of Kosadag. That's between the Mongols. The Mongols come in, wreck shit the fuck up, and annihilate the Sultanate of Rum. Because of the Seljuks' decline, alongside, of course, the Ilkhanate, who are a successor kingdom of the Mongol Empire, they basically slowly break the bays away from the Sultan's control. So the bays are becoming more and more independent. By the 14th century, the Turkish peoples have moved to the western coast of Anatolia and are reaching the Aegean Sea. But by this point, the bays are now completely independent and are marked by a multitude of different bays here. This is the 14th century look of the bays when the Sultanate of Rum is now gone. We have Teki, Hamanids, Karasanids. Of the most powerful of them, we have the, how do you pronounce this? Gurmiyanids? Gurmiyanids. We have, of course, did I only write down two? Okay, there are other powerful kingdoms here, but Gurmiyanids is one of them, and the other one is, of course, the Ottomans, right? These bays over here are vying for control. They have their own agenda. They have their own policy. The most important of them, however,
are the Ottomans. The Ottomans are the ones that swallow up all of Anatolia. And on page 32 of Osman's Dream by Carolina Finkel, it goes into why the Ottomans have such an advantage over all of these different beys here. Quote, known to us as the Ottomans, we first hear of the Ottomans around 1300 when, so a contemporary Byzantine historian tells us, there occurred in 1301 the first military encounter between Byzantine force and troops led by a man called Osman. This battle, the Battle of Beyfis, was fought not far from Constantinople on the southern shore of the Sea of Marmara. The Byzantine forces were routed. Ottoman sovereignty also called for nobler lineage than that of its rivals. From the early 15th century, then in the face of competing states, the Timurids and the Aquenlu, Turkoman tribal confederation which had moved west after the wave of migration which brought the Osman clan, the Ottomans were furnished with Central Asian descent from the Turkic Oghuz tribe and their illustrious ancestor, the Prophet Noah, who was said to have given the East to his son Japheth. So right, the Sultan of Rome is gone, so hello to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is expanding in all directions at this point, gobbling up the various beys that are in Anatolia, and at 1352, with the help of the Genoese, they even cross into what we know as Thrace. So they make their movement right over here across the crossing this the Bosphorus and heading, of course, to Thrace. There they have an establishment and a foothold in the Balkans. So this is where the Ottomans now expand across the Balkan area and Asia Minor at the same time. By this point, the indigenous Christians that lived under the Byzantine rule for centuries now were sick and tired of them. The Byzantines had basically alienated the indigenous Christians of this area. They had too many civil wars. The provincial aristocracy was just a fucking dickhead. So they were not super loyal to Constantinople at all. And the civil wars in 1340 in Constantinople didn't help the situation whatsoever. Now, on page 38 of Carolina's book, it actually goes over that the fundamental strength of the Ottomans in their expansion efforts throughout this area is due to what we know as the frontier warriors. Frontier warriors coming to fight for the Ottomans. Here's the quote. The expansion of the frontier was shared with quasi-independent fighters who had thrown in their lot with the Ottomans. Four such Muslim families were particularly prominent during the Ottoman conquest of Rumeli. These were the Evrensen-Sogulu, the Mihan-Logulu, the Turhan-Loguru, Malko-Koguru. The first two of these were families of Christian warriors in northwest Anatolia who crossed the Thrace as the Ottoman frontier advanced and converted to Islam, while the Malko dynasty, properly known as Malkovic, were of Christian Serb origin. The origins of the Turan, however, remain obscure by 1386. So the Ottomans are defeating many different enemies here. One of the big ones, of course, and let me write down this one, 1352 for the crossing of the Bosphorus here. And then, of course, we have 1398. 1390. Now I've written down that 1352 is where the Ottomans cross into the Balkans. By 1389 here, the Ottomans will face their first defeat, where Sultan Murad is basically killed by the Serbians. I'm only writing this down because the Ottomans basically enjoyed complete victory over and over again. Hell, even look at the Battle of Marcita, where the Serbians outnumbered the Ottomans, but then they all fucking drowned to death, unfortunately, in the conflict, which ended up being an Ottoman victory. So while the Serbians did win against Sultan Murad, killing him, it was only a minor setback. And basically it allowed for Sultan Bayezid to take over and basically continue his conquest of Asia Minor and the Balkans, to the point where Serbia and Byzantium both became vassals of the Ottoman Empire. Page 42 of Caroline's book goes into this actually. It's pretty funny and kind of morbid. So things aren't going well for the Byzantines. Hungary and friends attempt actually to fight the Ottomans. They will attack and attack the Ottomans at what we know as Nicopolis. The Battle of Nicopolis is an absolute failure at about 1396, leading to most of the Europeans basically giving up fighting the Ottomans altogether, right? There will be more conflicts with the Ottomans over and over again, but Nicopolis is one of these big boogeyman battles where they're like, yo, the Ottomans are fucking invincible. And I mean, I won't lie, they are. Except, of course, at the Battle of Ankara. This is between, of course, Giga Chad Tamerlane, of course, and the Ottoman forces. Now, Tamerlane is essentially dominating his, like, empire in Central Asia and Iran. But the only reason why he ends up getting involved with the Ottomans in the Battle of Ankara is because the Ottomans are attempting to extract tribute from a vassal underneath Tamerlane. Tamerlane does not stand for this, and so invades and attacks at the Battle of Ankara. So I believe this is Ankara, so we could go fuck, let me get a better color. So now we have the Battle of Ankara right here, and it's a huge battle. The Tamerlanes and the Ottoman armies are in the hundreds of thousands. Tamerlane brought fucking elephants. The Ottomans are bringing their own forces in the form of the Janissaries. The Janissaries are essentially Christian slave soldiers that are levied through the Dervish system, right? From Christian Balkan families. They're converted to Islam and trained in many different types of warfare. And so because of that, are elite fighting troops for the Sultan that are used in this battle. And eventually over time, they'll be like the premier fighting force for the Ottomans. Not really supplanting the Sepahis or the frontier Turkoman warriors of the Ottomans, but they form a elite gunpowder unit actually. Now this battle will be fought in 1402 and would be a complete Ottoman loss. The Tamerlane or Timur is able to outmaneuver the Ottomans, right? He cuts them off from their water supply, and then the Ottomans Turkoman like forces basically mutiny and join Tamerlane, which is very unfortunate. And so because of that, the Turkish Sultan is captured, and then there's a treaty made where all of his vassals are made independent. So Serbia and Constantinople are free and safe for now. Only continues problems as this leads into an Ottoman civil war that almost destroys the entire empire. Here's a quote from page 49 actually of this dynastic squabble. Neighboring states saw Prince Musa with his Wallachian support as a greater threat than Prince Mehmed. Stephen Lazarevich called on Mehmed to join him in a coordinated campaign against Musa. Mehmed's forces include men from the Emirate of Dulkadir in southeast Anatolia. Thanks to Mehmed's marriage with the emir's daughter, Byzantine troops provided by the emperor, Serbian, Bosnian, and Hungarian troops under the command of Stefan Lazarevich, troops from Aydin, whose support for Musa had been firm until just before the battle, and Rumelian troops commanded by the marcher lord Gazi Evranos Bey. Now the Byzantines attempted to take advantage of this Ottoman civil war, right, by supporting both sides, supplying troops, money, all that good shit. But by this point, Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire as a whole was fucking done for. It was over. It relied heavily on diplomacy, on tribute payments. It was unable to project its military forces like outside of its immediate territory. So like it's fucked. And by this point too, the Balkan area was split up between many principalities and smaller provinces and city-states. So because of that, they were easily gobbled up by the Ottomans, who came back from their Ottoman civil war more centralized and stronger than ever, actually. If you must know, would lead, of course, to this map right here. A very famous map. This is the Ottoman Sultanate in 1453. You see it dominating all of Asia Minor, with the exceptions being the Karamids over here and the Kandars here. They are dominating the Balkans with the exception of course, Albania, a couple of Byzantine holdouts, which are in Greece and in Constantinople, respectively. And then, of course, there's Serbian vassal here. Very cute, very submissive, and breedable. Where did I drop my thing? So this leads to the last clash of the Byzantines and the Ottomans, the siege of Constantinople in 1453. The Ottos, with the help their Janissary slave soldiers, their thousands and tens of thousands of Turkish warriors, their massive fucking cannons over here. Fun fact, the engineer of these cannons actually went to the Byzantines to see if they would, pay for these cannons. The Byzantines said no, obviously because they're broke, and they sold these cannons to the Ottomans instead. That is what I call capitalism right there. And they had a huge fleet that basically surrounded the city on all sides. So Constantinople was fucked. Here's an account by Tursun Bey on page 65 of Caroline's book, which goes into the Ottoman siege in question. Quote, "On the outside, the champions of Islam, and on the inside, the wayward ones, pike to pike in true combat, hand to hand, now advancing, now fainting, guns firing and arms drawn. Countless heads were severed from their trunks, expelling the smoke of the Greek fire. Veritable cloud of sparks was rained on the champions of Islam by the infidels, ramming into the castle walls, the trenches in this manner. They set off the Greek fire. The enemies, in turn they, the Ottoman soldiers, presented to the bastion their hooked pikes, drawn, knocking to the ground the engaged warriors, as if struck in the deepest bedrock by the digging of a tunnel. It seemed that in places the castle had been pierced from below. By the early part of the forenoon, the frenzy of the fiery tumult and the dust of strife had died away." And that basically is like the final, straw for the Turkish people in Asia Minor. We basically explained the question of where Turkey came from, at least one half of the question, and which leads into, of course, the Ottoman Empire. Boom, baby. Ignore everything that you saw beforehand. This is what we're talking about here. For about hundreds of years, the Ottoman Empire basically expands in all directions, dominating 3 different continents, and basically staying in Asia Minor till about 1918, actually, where they lose in World War I, the Turkish War of Independence happens, blah, 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 blah. They have this is one of their flags, by the way. I think this is the flag of the 1500s or some shit like that. But yeah, blah, blah, blah. They lose World War I. They lose almost in the Turkish Civil War, if not for the efforts of Mustafa Kemal. Mustafa Kemal comes in, fucks shit up, creates the Republic of Turkey, and boom, the nation of Turkey is founded. That is the history of Turkey. Why Turks live in Turkey, how they got to Turkey, the steps involved in it. But there's still more time left. That's because, of course, we're not talking about the second Turkish homeland, the second place that all Turks come from, the place that we all know where they come from. They come from, of course, Turan. So, towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, there is a belief that is slowly getting prominence. This is the belief known as Turanism, and I will write that down right here. Turanism. Turanism follows the belief that Ural-Altaic, Mongolic, Tungustic, and Turkic, all these languages are shared from a same common language. In Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's book, which is way too long for me to pronounce, it argues that all human languages have one origin. Here's how it follows. There is an original human language, so that's the OG human language, that splits off into 2. We then have Aramaic and Japhic. That is then split into 2 more branches, which is Scythian and Celtic. This splits off into 2 more branches, which of course is Slavic and Turkic. So that is essentially the original point of Turanism in 1710 right here. This is argued for. So this is the tree of languages of human history. Turanism comes from the word Turan. Turan is a landmass that is named in the book Shahnameh by Ferdowsi. Shahnameh is one of the most important pieces of Iranian history. So here we go. That's a terrible marker color. Here, we'll stay with this. Shahnameh. Damn, I'm gonna throw this shit out. All right, I need to have a picture of Ferdowsi because he looks so hushkel, and I felt like because we were gonna say his name a lot, we needed his picture on standby. So the Shahnameh is an epic written by Ferdowsi. Okay, right here is his spelling of the name, and in Shahnameh there's a term known as Turan, which indicates the lands above Iran. Right here. Okay. Now, here's how the story goes. In time, past, right? We're talking like the very ancient history of Iran before the Persian Empire and shit. Iran was ruled over by a serpent king named Zahak, okay? This serpent king would rule for a long period of time and then would be usurped by Feyruddin, who smashes his skull. No, he doesn't kill him. He basically imprisons him in Mount Damavad. But essentially, Feyruddin is smashing skulls with his bull mace, and he has 3 sons, Salm, Tur, and Iraj. And based on a situation involving a dragon, he divides up his empire between his 3 sons according to how they dealt with the dragon. Now, Salm is given the west, so he's given Rome and Anatolia. Tur, right, is given the north and China, right? And then Iraj is given Iran. Now, because of the fact that Iran is seen as the best of land, Salm and Tur right here basically kill Iraj. And so afterwards, Feyruddin makes his grandson Manukur the ruler of Iraj. And so because that, Manukur is essentially attempting to gain a vengeance for his father's death. Thus, the Iranian-Turanian wars begin. And so that is the whole history of it. You can see here, actually, we're getting a little bit too ahead of ourselves. So that's basically the gist of where Turan comes from. Now, where does the Shahnameh come from? Now, the Shahnameh is actually very, very, very old in its origin. First and foremost, Turan isn't even a word in the old texts that the Shahnameh is based off of. The word is actually Turaya, okay? Turaya is a term used in the Zoroastrian religious texts known as the Avesta. Turaya, the term, is in one of the gathas of the Avesta, which are basically 17 hymns in the Avesta. And it's believed that these gathas actually come from the word of Zoroaster himself, of the Zoroastrian religion actually, through an oral tradition that we know of. Now, the Turayas are first mentioned in the Ushtavati Gatha. So I'll write that down right here. In this Gatha, it talks about how there's a family from Turaya, the family Freya of Tur. So I'll write that down right here. And this family is apparently a follower of the gods Ahura Mazda and Asha, which are essentially divinities in Zoroastrianism. So there's no link between, at this moment, the enemy of Turan and Iran at this moment. It's seen that the Turayas are just like a normal Zoroastrian believing people actually. So Turan isn't seen as an enemy just yet, until of course the Farwadin Yasht. The Farwadin Yasht is part of 21 Yashts that are basically hymns of praise for specific Zoroastrian deity. In this, and here's a quote from this passage right here, quote, "You then overcame the resistance of the Turanian Danus. You then overcame the hostilities of the Turanian Danus. Thanks to you, the Karshnasids, having good men, became the strongest. The brave Zatawids, the brave Shashayants, the brave victors. You destroyed the crumbling dwellings together with their sites of the Danus, who are lord of tens of thousands." So as you can see, this is where we see the Turanians or the Turayas being seen as an enemy. And over here, you can see a viewpoint of the world from the perspective of the Farwadin Yash. Avestan lands, these are the lands that the Iranian people, right, they speak the Avestan languages. This is where Zoroastrian comes from. And then we also see different Iranian groups. We see the Turanians, the Dahi, the Sarmatians, basically. Sorry everybody, I had to remake this section of the video because it was lost because I deleted it on the camcorder that I am using. So we're going to remake this section. Right now we are talking, of course, about the Shahnameh in question. We had just done talking about the Farwadin Yasht, which is essentially a collection of texts that were made around the time of the Avestan period, which is a way early period of history for Iran and Asia at the time. Now, the Avestan period basically lasts from 1500 BCE
to 500 BCE. And that period is subdivided between Old and New. The Old text refers to, of course, Zoroaster and friends, and then the New text refers to, of course, basically texts after this period. So this is essentially like everything after Zoroaster's words and his initial followers. Now, the legendary Yashts, which are basically the collection of texts that are mostly reflected in the Shahnameh, that contain most of the legendary stories, all the stuff that you know and love, and all of the evil deeds of the Turanians exists within these Yashts. And they were created during the Achaemenid Empire. So they are part of the new Avestan period of texts. And actually, this would be Old Avestan and this would be Younger Avestan, actually. Now, in these stories, there's some differences between, of course, these Yashts and the previous stories that we talked about, but there's also some similarities to the Shahnameh. There is an Eric Shah, the archer, and he basically will fire his bow from Iran and all the way to the Oxus River, therefore creating the boundary between Turan and Iran. If you know of the Shahnameh, you know Eric Shah is actually Arash the archer in the Shahnameh in question. Now, a lot of these Yash would be compiled together in the Sassanid period in what we know as the Hoda-Nameh. Now, the Hoda-Nameh is a lost Middle Persian language theorized to be compiled by Khosrow I. So Khosrow I, from 531 to 579 CE, during his reign, basically creates the Hoda-Nameh to compile all of these texts together. However, this text is lost to us, and it's only from the text of the Shahnameh of Abu Mansur do we actually have the surviving text of the Hoda-Nameh. The Shahnameh of Abu Mansur essentially contains the lost text of the Hoda-Nameh. However, this text becomes lost to us, and only 15 pages survive. Ferdowsi will, of course, include this Shahnameh with its 15 pages, with its 1,000 verses in his own Shahnameh. So this Shahnameh continues to survive to this day. Now, Ferdowsi's mission was always to start on the Shahnameh. That is because he comes from the Persian landowning class known as the Deccan. The Deccan are a Persian landowning class that had existence in the pre-Islamic time and survived in the post-Islamic phase of Iran, essentially. Under the Samanid Empire, about 940 CE, we see the flourishing of pre-Islamic texts by the patrons of the Samanids. And so because of this, because the Deccan are attached to the pre-Islamic tales and the lineage of legendary kings, they are seen as their duty to write down and collect these texts to preserve pre-Islamic culture. So Ferdowsi starts his work at about 977 CE by a poet by the name of Daikiki. Daikiki, of course, will die because of the assassination by his slave. And so now we're finally done with this section that talks about a little bit of the backstory of the Shahnameh, and we go on to the rest of our lecture. So the Ferdowsi basically gets a lot of his information from the Shahnameh of al-Rakaz. This is basically like his main source. So yeah, Samanid Empire, 977 CE, he starts his work. In 994 CE, he gets patronage from the Samanids, but in the 990s, the Ghaznavids take over, as you remember earlier in the video. But then Ferdowsi continues his work, and he even praises the Ghaznavids as well, which they're kind of bored by. And then in 1010 CE, the epic is finished. Now, this is extremely influential, not only to the Iranian people, but the Turks as well, as they will see themselves in the Turanians due to the shared location, right? Central Asia, Central Asia for the Turanians, Central Asia for the Turks. And they would start to adopt Persianite culture. Like I said beforehand, the Karakhanid were the first Muslim state in Central Asia, and one of the first Muslim Turkic states to push Persianite culture and history. The Karakhanids would claim that they came from the lineage of Alp-Turga, actually, and of course from the house of Afrizabad. Let me see if I spelled that right. All right, so I did get the spelling wrong. It's Afrasiab. So basically, they claim that they come from Alp-Turga and house of Afrasiaba, right? Now, this guy over here is basically a Turanian hero, actually, from the Shahnameh. Here is a portrait of him. I believe he is killing his father. He's also like magical and has powers and shit like that. That's for the Shahnameh. But basically, the Karakhanids say that they come from this house in Alp-Turga. Alp-Turga is essentially the mythological founder of the Karakhanids and is a mythological hero in Turkish mythology. So we're getting right back to Turkish mythology. Alp-Turga, keep calling it Turga. Alp-Turga comes from the Oguz Name, or the book of Didi Korkut. Basically, these two books right here, the Oguz Name and Book of Didi Korkut, have various different tales and legends from Turkish mythology. The Oguz Name is basically a series of manuscripts and tales about the Oguz Turks and the legendary founder of the Oguz Turks, Oguz Khan. Now, these series of books, they deal with a bunch of different shit. There's dragons, there's giants, there's gods. There's a lot of stuff. The mythology of Oguz Khan goes as follows. He is the ancestor of all the Oguz Turks. He slayed a dragon. He switched from breast milk to kimiz, which is like an alcoholic horse milk drink. And then he would just eat meat. He grew from a baby to an adult in 40 days. So he's a big boy. He creates a band of Turkic chiefs, about 40 of them, and then he has sex with not one, but 2 supernatural women, which give him a lineage of children, actually. And I'll display it on screen. The various Oguz Turk tribes claim lineage from these tribes that Oguz Khan had basically created from the children that he had with these 2 supernatural women. Soon becomes Khan of all 4 corners. Him and his sons defeat Rome with a large sky wolf. It's pretty epic. He's basically like an avatar of Tengri. So a connection to Tengriism. They conquer basically most of the Asiatic and Eurasian world. And then basically he splits his empire up between 2, right? So then there are the 3 arrows, and then there are the gray arrows. And Oguz Khan basically splits his territory up between the 3 arrows and the gray arrows, essentially. The gray arrows, of course, being the Oguz Turks. The descendants of these peoples become like the Karakoyunlu, the Akkoyunlu, Seljuks, Ottomans, you know, all this shit. Now, as stated, Turks do not share any connection whatsoever to Turanians whatsoever, aside from occupying the same landmass. These Turanian peoples in the Avesta, in the Avestan language in Middle Persian, are supposed to represent the pre-Islamic Iranian populations that existed prior to the 7th century, where the Turks came in and like Turkified them. And the Seljuks were very influenced, super influenced by the Shahnameh. They loved this shit. They ate it up like it was fucking nothing but pizza. In fact, Seljuk Sultan Togrul III recited the Shahnameh in battle while swinging his battle mace around. Fuck. And it won't stop there. There are illustrated manuscripts that existed in the Timurids, the Karakoyunlu, the Ottomans. And so because of that, we delete all of this and we get on to modern times now. Because we have to get to, of course, oh my god, fucking erase this faster. Now, we have to go to 1659 to the Khan
of Khiva. The Khan of Khiva, by a name of Abu al-Ghazi Bahadur, he basically makes what we know as the Shajara-e Tarakima. It basically is a tale, right, that connects the Adamic myth of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism with, of course, Turkic myth, with a little sprinkling of Shahnameh on the side, right? That's basically the formation of the Shajara-e Tarakima. And this is how it follows. Adam, right? Adam is Adaming. He has a son named Noah, right? Noah is knowing. He has 3 different sons, okay? He has Ham, Sam, and Yagas. Ham and Sam fuck off to some other areas, I don't know. But Yagas goes to the Volga and the Ural rivers. And he has 8 children. One of those children that he named successor would be Turk. That alone basically connects Turk to the Oghuz Nameh. So from Turk comes Oghuz Khan. This is where, of course, Wilhelm Gottfried got his inspiration for the Turanian languages that we talked about earlier. And this came about actually in 1729 with the English translation actually of the Shajara-e Tarakima. So basically in 1729, the entire European world actually understands what Turan means, and this is where Turanism comes into play. There is a man by a name of Max Muller, or Frederick Max Muller. He basically, in 1855, argues that we should divide up the Turanian languages, or not divide, okay, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Max Muller argues that we should divide up non-Aryan and non-Semitic Asian languages, combining them into Turanian, and then subdividing them into North and South. And this will be important for you Finns, that the Ural-Altaic languages are in the northern subdivision, actually. Now, there's a Finnish linguist by the name of Matthias Satrin concluded that Finns came from Central Asia, and he found this out by traveling to Central Asia, to where the Finns probably originate from. And he believed that all Turkic peoples should unite as one. Now, this is a belief among many Europeans, actually. Some people in Turkey didn't agree with this, like a Ziya Golkalp. He would argue that the only people who should combine are only Turkic people, and that's it. There's a certain quote about unification of this Turanism from a European, that being Lothrop Sodard. He's basically part of the multiple movements in Finland for Turanism. Turanism actually becomes very, very popular in Finland overall, and that is because of actually World War I. The Finnish are seen as isolated from the world, and they want to connect to a much larger world, that being a world of Turks, of Tatars, and all these different peoples, not just of Nordic. Hungary would have its own connections to Turanism, because Hungarians actually have a Turkic origin, that being, of course, the Magyars that migrated westward to Hungary, who were originally Attila and the Hunnic Empire, I think. I kind of forgot. Figures like Sandor Korosi basically would migrate to Asia to find the ancestors of the Hungarians, of the Magyars. And ultimately, the movements of Turanism are essentially a way of combating Pan-Slavicism and Pan-Germanism, actually. So that's what both of these two countries are trying to counter with Turanism, to connect themselves to countries that they normally would never have a reason to connect to. Finland and Hungary will definitely push more for Turanism as a global mission than Turkey. And this is definitely evident in Hungary when they lose like most of their population, because of the fact after the end of World War I, their empire was split up. So most Hungarians lived outside of their borders. So they had to find some way of connecting outside with people, right? And that will happen actually. They'll create connections with Estonians, with Finnish, with Japanese, with Turks, with all these different peoples. This would unfortunately end at the end of World War II because of the Soviet occupation, but it'll have a resurgence in the modern times, and you'll see Hungarians being part of different Turkic organizations because of their Magyar influence. Hungarian Turanism is kind of weird. They depict a Jesus that was Parthian and Turanian. So now Turanism overall, this whole movement will apex actually at about 1932. 1932 is when it apexes. That is for a variety of reasons actually, and there's actually two in question that we'll be talking about. And that'll be, of course, the Turkish history thesis. Oh boy. In July 11, 1932, about 18 professors and 196 high school teachers will teach at the University of Istanbul. At the University of Istanbul, they will unveil their grand project, the Turkish history thesis. I forgot the speaker at the time, but basically I'll talk about what Turkish history thesis is. It is the belief that Turks moved from their homeland in Central Asia to China, Balkans, Middle East, and all corners of the world in waves, populating the areas of the planet that are unoccupied or uncivilized. So you can see here, this isn't really of what I'm talking about, but this is a good map of it. Basically, they migrate from Central Asia and they move across the planet, and they found various civilizations and empires that we come to know and love, right? Hittites, Harappa, Sumerians, Greek civilization, all these different civilizations that existed in Bronze Age and before the Turkic movements are apparently actually Turkish. The Hittites, the Harappa, the Sumerians, they're all Turkish actually, because they are basically Turks that migrated from Central Asia and moved across Europe and Asia. And this was a whole ploy to separate the yellowness of Turanism. You see, a lot of people would just view Turanism as just like a form of an Asiatic thing. So the Turkish history thesis was to show off that no, actually, all of these great ancient civilizations were all Turkish, and the original Turks were white, and they escaped this inner Asia territory and left Central Asia and went to go populate all these areas, and that the Turks only moved out because of a climate change, because there was an inner ocean that existed that they could take a part in, and you had iron working and shit, and these white Turks would go across the world, teach civilization to all these people because of the climate change here. This apparently happened 7,000 years before all of this fucking garbage happened. Along with this came another theory known as the Sun language thesis. Oh, no, Sun language theory, sorry. Sorry, I was adding two theses. Now, Sun language theory theorizes that all languages on this earth came from the Turks. That you could take hieroglyphics from Sumeria and from Egypt. These hieroglyphics and these carvings and these cuneiform symbols, right? They're basically from the original Sun language that the Turks moving across Asia were teaching to these people. And Ataturk actually gave formal support for the Sun language theory actually. In fact, Ataturk would also somewhat support the Turkish history thesis as well. Both of these working in tandem with each other actually. The Turks were so affected by the sun that they thought that the sun was a connection to evil. The sun was therefore called Og, Ag. And all languages are supposed to come from this one group of people. That is because the Turkish language, when Mustafa Kemal was taking over, was trying to get rid of all the loan words that the Turkish language had from Arabic and Persian. And instead of getting rid of them, they just said, oh hey, they always existed in the Turkish language because their origin is Turkish. Stuff like bulletin, electricity, Aphrodite, they are seen as words with Turkish origins to the Sun language theory. Hell, the funniest thing about the Sun language theory and the Turkish history thesis is that they claim that the Kurds don't fucking exist. That the Kurds are just Turks that forgot that they were Turks. Now, after Mustafa Kemal's death, both the Sun language theory and the history thesis would be dropped and wouldn't be brought back again. Two authors, actually, Konstantin Sheko and Stephen Brown, argue that pseudo-history of this nature is not something that comes from a healthy source. It comes from trauma, actually. And that pseudo-history just comes from basically trauma as a way of coping with the fact that your ancestors failed in some way, that your people failed in some way. So you have to create a pseudo-history to protect yourself from that failure. But some would argue that this isn't pseudo-history. I mean, think about it. Like, hold on a second, 7,000 years ago, Turks moved from Central Asia. We know who moved from Central Asia. We do. That would be the Fingolians. The Fingolians left Central Asia, so this is a Fingolian yurt, right? The Fingolians left Central Asia to go and populate other lands and to teach these other lands. And so we know that Fingolia is actually connected to these people. This isn't the route of the Turks. This is the route of the Turanians. Some being Fingolians, and you look over here, some being Koreans, that they move eastward to Korea. And in fact, if you've watched my videos on Fingolia and the Hwan Goji or the Hwan Empire, you'll know that Fingolia traces older ancestry and their cultural practices of like saunas and yurting and Mongolian throat singing to the Turanians. And that Koreans actually come from the Altai Mountains as well, and Lake Baikal, that a lot of these Turkish people would link themselves to Turan with. So ultimately, both the Koreans and the Finns are Turks. And if you want to know more about that history, you can watch my video on Fingolia and my video of the Hwan Empire. Or you can follow the playlist, which has this video along with all the future videos of this series. Thank you to all the lovely and beautiful patrons for making this video possible and for making my life possible. See you guys next time. Bye. Look at this cat. Look at this cat. Cat.